So we've seen separation of church and state, the value of the individual person, the notion of the higher law. Christian presuppositions abound in American constitutional order. Think of the Declaration of Independence. In fact, the whole American constitutional order depends upon something like the biblical worldview. Think of the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident," right? Obviously true. That all men are created equal. Now, where did he get that idea? It's of biblical origin. That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Where do our rights come from? We've talked about this early on, but it's worth emphasizing again. They come from God. God has made us the kind of being that is inherently entitled to be treated a certain way. And that to secure such rights, governments are instituted among men. Well, the reason I'm highlighting these things is because I want you to consider what it would be like to utterly remove these Christian and biblical presuppositions from our society and from our kind of political order. The value of the individual, the distinction between church and state, the idea that there's a law above the king, that there is an independent moral authority capable of judging justice or injustice, and so forth. The American idea of natural rights, and that government is limited to the protection of natural rights and so forth. They all disappear if God is dead, which is going to be the subject of our next discussion, because as we shall see, when the trustees of this institution in 1968 wrote into its bylaws that all students would take this freedom class, already this process of the undermining of the free society had begun. And what's at the root of that? The root of it, there are many factors, but one of the most important, and maybe perhaps the pivotal event that is leading to the crumbling of traditional American order, is what Nietzsche famously called the death of God in the 19th century. As we shall see, starting with the French Revolution, and maybe earlier, depending how far back you want to go, but certainly with the French Revolution in the late 18th century, and proceeding with increasingly militant force in the 19th century, there was a concerted movement disavowing the God of the Bible. Camus called it Albert Camus, the great French novelist, called it a metaphysical revolt against God. And you see throughout the era, all the great thinkers, the titans of thought of the 19th century, from Nietzsche to Auguste Comte in France, Karl Marx, John Stuart Mill, and many others, were united in their belief that Christianity was pernicious, that it had been okay in earlier centuries, but it now had a pernicious effect on society, that they looked at the French Revolution as an anti-Christian revolution, and they said, wonderful, good, we've broken the back of Christianity, and we are going to be replacing it with something better. Christianity is dead and gone, and we need a new political or secular religion to take its place. This was a massive project throughout the 19th century, and all kinds of people were doing it in different cultural contexts. As I said, Hegel, Nietzsche, Comte, Marx, Mill. They believed Christianity was obsolete and moribund and good riddance, and something better was going to be created by human minds who were capable of creating a better and more noble religion. John Stuart Mill called it, and following Auguste Comte, called it the religion of humanity, which was his preferred religion to replace Christianity. We don't call it the religion of humanity today. Instead, we call it, secular humanism. But the fundamental idea is that God is dead. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill's mentor, one of them, said, he's talking about the idea of natural rights, and he said, the concept of natural rights is nonsense on stilts. Well, it is nonsense if God is dead, if there is no God. Nietzsche looked at this phenomenon. He's living at the end of the 19th century, and he was observing all of this militant, irrational hatred of the Bible, but he was in support of it. He himself contributed to this virulent anti-Christianity. He said, when something is falling, one should push it, and so he himself contributed to this. But he alone among these thinkers was sensitive enough to realize what was going to happen with this death of God movement. The phrase itself comes from a little book that Nietzsche wrote called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And in that book, The village idiot is walking around in the morning with a lantern, waking everybody up, and he says, "Wake up, wake up, wake up, I have big news, important news." Well, what's the news? God is dead. We have murdered him. And why have we murdered him? Nietzsche tells us why. How else could we ourselves become gods? So Nietzsche sees this death of God movement is happening, but he also sees what's going to happen. He says, what have we done? We have unchained the earth from the sun. It's a brilliant metaphor because it applies on two levels. What would happen from a physical basis if somehow we were able to unchain the earth from the sun? It would be out of orbit. Well, obviously the earth would spiral off into chaos and destruction. We'd all be destroyed physically. But we can also look at it as a cultural metaphor. What have we done? We have unchained the earth from the sun, meaning for almost 2,000 years, Western civilization had developed in the orbit of the fixed Son of God, right? The Christian revelation. As we said, all of our institutions were shaped in accordance with the biblical worldview. But now God is dead. We have unchained the earth, the cultural earth, from the sun. What's going to happen? Well, what happened was exactly what did happen in the 20th century, the most barbaric century in all of human history, where at a minimum 100 million people were murdered by their own governments in the name of the various new political religions that emerged to replace what was increasingly seen as a dead and gone Christianity. And I'm talking here about communism, Marxism, fascism, Nazism, and all the other ideological movements of the 20th century. Which can only be regarded as a form of spiritual pathology by people who have rejected, militantly and irrationally and hatefully rejected, the God of the Bible, and we're looking for some kind of political salvation in this world, channeling religious aspirations into strictly material concerns, creating the new communist paradise on earth or the 1,000-year Reich of the Nazi imagination, and so forth. We're living right now in a very interesting period. Most of the real horrors of the 20th century were confined mostly to European society. But now those same trends which led to that destruction have come to the United States. And we also in the United States are experiencing a militant revolt against the God of the Bible. Christianity, at least since the 1960s, has been progressively pushed out of the public square. Christianity has been relegated to the status of a private subjective preference that is sort of tolerated, but certainly has no authority in the public sphere. Christianity has been removed from the schools, from our public squares, from our monuments, and all the rest of it. And that's not accidental. This is a consequence of these larger movements that I'm describing to you, this death of God movement. And Christianity is the target in this because you can be any other religion you want except for a serious Christian. It's because it was the Christian God who was at the center of the development of Western civilization. And if you want to destroy that civilization, as Karl Marx and many others recognize, you have to go to the root, and the root being a spiritual one, a metaphysical and spiritual root, the biblical religion. And that's why we see these ongoing attacks on Christianity and so forth. And very successful, I might add. But we have to ask ourselves how we are going to preserve the values of our civilization, which are all intimately bound up with the Christian and the biblical worldview. That is just a fact of reality. All of our institutions presuppose something like the Christian understanding of existence, and certainly the framers and founders they're living in the 18th century, which had not yet seen this destructive phenomenon of the death of God. They were all people of the book who took seriously biblical religion, and it underlies all of their political constructions, every single one of them. People sometimes argue, is America a Christian nation? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. We're not a Christian nation in the sense that Iran is an Islamic nation, where the Iranian authorities police the spiritual life of people, and there is no distinction made between religion and government. But we are a Christian people in the sense that all of our institutions presuppose something like the biblical worldview, and all of our values are parasitic on the spiritual values embraced by Western man as a result of his embrace of biblical religion. And so it is no small matter, this ongoing attack on Christianity. You can't really call it anything else. And you need to be, and in some respects, Christians are responsible for this, for failing to understand the deep significance of Christianity for our social and political order, and for not defending Christianity against its various attackers over the past, certainly since the 1960s, which is something we'll discuss in our last and final lecture when we talk about how the U.S. Constitution has been transformed away from the framers' intent toward what we have today. It's very much bound up with this death of God movement, because what dies along with God? The idea of truth, the idea of eternal, absolute morality, unchanging morality, an unchanging order of law and being. All that is ejected and supplanted by progressivism, which rejects the idea, and postmodernism as well, other important movements, postmodernism, progressivism, multiculturalism, and now, of course, we see this neo-Marxism of the new woke religion and so forth, and many other forms of what scholars call political or secular religions, which are intended to supplant biblical religion. So our last discussion will try to draw out the impact of the death of God movement on the free society, American society, and discuss in more detail some of those movements that I just mentioned. So I'll see you then for our final session. It's hard to believe that this course is drawing to a close, but there will be one more. We'll talk about the transformation of American society that has been wrought with the death of God in the postmodern world. All right, till then, bye.